very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us at today's Translation for Impact webinar series. My name is Lorraine. I'm co-leading the Research Practice Policy Group at the Office of Research at NIE. Just a quick introduction to the Research Practice Policy Group, or RPPG for short. We were set up in 2023 at the beginning of the fifth tranche of funding of research from the Ministry of Education in Singapore. The purpose is really to strengthen the research practice policy nexus, deepening research translation and impact to bring Singapore's education practices to the next level. As you can see on the screen, we engage in research dissemination to both policymakers and lay audiences, engagement and partnerships, especially through our biannual flagship conference called the Redesigning Pedagogy International Conference. And we also implement an impact through both NIE's pre-service education, ongoing in-service training, as well as public discourse on education matters. And that brings me very nicely to introduce to you today's webinar. In order for research to have an impact in the broader society, it is important for us to engage policymakers effectively and to help bridge that gap between research and policy making. So with us today are two very experienced researchers, Drs. Dennis Kwek and Justin Lee, who will share just how they go about doing so. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Dennis Kwek. Next slide, please. Dennis is the Center Director for the Center for Research in Pedagogy and Practice, CRPP. He's also the Associate Dean Strategic Engagement at the Office for Research, where I'm from, the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University. A senior education research scientist with over 30 years of research experience in the UK and Singapore. His research interests include system studies in education, policy research, classroom pedagogies, sociology and philosophy of education, and teacher professional development. He's currently leading the National Institute of Education's core research program since 2004 until present. It is a multi-million-dollar government-funded large-scale baseline suite of empirical studies into Singapore's classroom pedagogies. So without further ado, I'll now hand the time over to Dennis. Dennis, please.
All right. So I've titled this particular talk, Connecting Research to Policy, and subtitle of Growing Pains of the Core Research Program. The core research program is one that we've been running since 2004. It's one of the longest standing research studies in Singapore, and one that has been, we like to think and we like to believe, influencing MOE policies in particular. And I've titled this Growing Pains because the act of connecting research or translating research to policymakers is one that the emphasis here is on translation. And if you think about the word translation itself, it's, often when we travel overseas, we go to a foreign country and like, for example, you go to Japan and you're using a different language, or you're listening or hearing a different language, and you're trying to translate that, right? And that's the same thing that I think of when I'm thinking about the research sphere and the policy sphere. Both are two different cultures, two different ways of understanding language as well. And for me, even after spending so many years engaging policymakers, I am still struggling with that act of translation itself. For this particular quick, brief presentation, I'm going to be talking about two key concepts and how I've applied that to the core research program. But a bit of context first. So this particular slide shows the tripartite relationship between MOE, NIE, and schools. NIE is the sole teacher training institute in Singapore. It is also the one of the universities or institute of higher learning where we conduct a lot of education research. It is largely funded by the ministry. And those kinds of research gets translated in two directions, if you see the triangle, to policymakers in MOE and to practitioners in schools. Increasingly, that because the funding comes from the ministry, the impact agenda is very, very strong. In other words, funded research should have as much impact on policy, practice, or programs. And therefore, as a result of that, a translation of that research to policy, practice, or programs is very important as well. And one of the key challenges when you think about translation is that research typically takes quite a few years from the beginning of the study all the way to when it actually closes or when there's findings available to be shared, typically about 2 to 3 years. Policy cycles, on the other hand, moves far more quickly. So there is always that disconnect between the research cycle and the policy cycle. And that's something that's important to bear in mind. The first concept that I'm going to be introducing to you is known as the triple helix idea. And this is from some folks called Henry Etzkowitz. And they have come up with this idea of a triple helix as a DNA of innovation, if you like. And it is that interaction between the government, the university, and the industry. And if you think of a lot of the modern innovations that we have, from the iPhones to even AI, it is the interaction between these three institutions, the government, the university, and the industry, that causes a lot of innovations to occur. And if you think of it, there's three particular models for these kinds of interactions within the three institutional organizations. One is what's known as a statist model. So in other words, the government overrides the university and the industry. The second model is the laissez-faire model, where the government, the university, and the industry tends to take on a little bit more arm's length interactions. So in these two diagrams that you see here, I've actually translated it into our specific context. So we're talking about the ministry working with the university, which is NIE, and the schools. What we tend to think of is this particular model here, which is one where the three blobs intersect in a middle. And this is important because for translation of research into policy or practice to occur, that middle section, the intersection between the three of them, is critical. So the first key thing about this particular triple helix model is that the infrastructure for translation is compulsory. You have to have a particular organizational structure, which we call a hybrid organization, to exist in order for that translation to be as optimal as possible. And that particular intersection, that organization that exists there, is one that is important. And it has that kind of overlapping spheres in between them. We call them the research brokering organizations. And those organizations tend to take the roles and functions of one another, whether it is schools, NIE, or MOE. And in those organizations, two important things happen. Firstly, they must have boundary workers. Boundary workers are people who cross those boundaries often between the intersections. They are always held accountable for the work that they do, which is the translation work. And they have a particular set of competencies as well. They must be able to translate. They must know how the other institutions or how the other spheres understand language, if you like. The second thing that is important as well is the idea of boundary crossing. So in order for these kinds of intersections and the kinds of work that happens at those intersections to occur, boundary crossing happens. Chris Chapman, who is one of our CJ co-professors this year, and he's coming in a week's time, talks about the idea of boundary spanners and boundary crossings in the form of reticulists, who are skilled communicators, they're excellent networkers, they're strategic in their orientation, and they're contextually astute and problem solvers. Now, part of the work that boundary workers do is to create what is known as boundary objects, which bridges those kinds of worlds and satisfy the requirements, the informational requirements of those worlds. And those boundary objects are not academic articles, if you think about it. As researchers, as academics, we tend to produce academic articles for journals, for example, or for books, academic books. Those are not boundary objects because those fulfill the informational requirements of the academic world. It does not fulfill the requirements of the other worlds, for example, the policy world. In order for that to happen, we tend to create boundary objects such as presentations, meetings with policymakers, policy-friendly reports, conducting workshops, etc., and all that. So those formats are in a very particular way as well. We can't just we can't just create a presentation that you can use in an academic conference with the introduction, methodology, with the, the sampling, the research methods that's used, and then followed by the findings, and then find the implications for policy and practice. For presentations to policymakers, the methodology and the research design is not as important as the implications and the recommendations. So the research design tends to be assumed that it is rigorous, it is important, yes, but it tends to be sidelined as opposed to the implications. So there are always adjustments in terms of the translational requirements when we move from one to the other. And that's one thing that when we think about translation, it's that move from dissemination. So that's presenting reports, for example, to move towards engagement. And that's really kind of more interactional, more dialogic in nature towards implementation, which is the actual working with the end users, if you like. The second concept is what's known as Pasteur's quadrant by Donald Stokes. And he talks about scientific innovation and scientific research and how it's really linked to the kinds of applications. And he has this particular axis, which is on the one axis, which is on rigor, and the other axis is on relevance. So on the one hand, you have research that is highly rigorous and highly relevant, which is on the top right-hand side. And that's Pasteur's quadrant. And that's kind of like the ideal place to be, because you want research to be both rigorous and you want research to be relevant to the users as well. But typically research can be highly rigorous, but not relevant. And that tends to be the pure basic research. And research can also be very relevant, but not very rigorous. And that's pure applied research. And of course, on the other hand, the other extreme is research that is not rigorous or relevant at all, which we call the Mickey Mouse quadrant. We've modified that to include another dimension, which we call timeliness, which I think is relevant, particularly in Singapore's context. Here, we're talking about research that is rigorous, relevant, and timely, because I mentioned before, the research cycle and the policy cycle has to be somehow aligned. And because policy cycle tends to be faster than the research cycle, timeliness is a matter of how fast we can do research that is equally rigorous and of relevance to the end users, in this case, policymakers or practitioners. So in our case, at least for me and the core research program that we're involved in, a lot of our research work tends to be very fast and furious. We just finished the last 2 to 3 weeks. We've been almost burning the midnight oil, creating a new set of presentation slides for an upcoming presentation that we had to do to policymakers. And it requires us to really have almost a lack of sleep trying to create that deck of slides, because it requires us to think even harder about the kind of message or the narrative that we're trying to convey to the policymakers. So how does the Pasteur's quadrant, the version that we have, apply? Let me give you the story from Core 1, which was started in 2004. Core research program has been around since 2000 and in the early 2000s, and it's been funded in 5-year cycles, if you like. Core 1, 5 years, Core 2, 5 years, etc. And in Core 1, because it is a large-scale baseline studies of us, and the research questions are how do teachers teach, why do they teach the way they do, and how do students learn, a lot of the research findings are new to the policymakers, and therefore a lot of it is highly rigorous, it is highly relevant, and we could take some degree of time in order to do that, because they don't have anything prior to this particular study that tries to document what's happening in terms of teaching and learning in our Singapore context. We produce reports like what you see on the left-hand side, huge, about 1-inch thick volumes that were produced and presented to the ministry for them to consume. This is a form of dissemination that we did. In Core 2, we spent even more time. The principal investigator at the time believed that it has to be even more rigorous. So its rigor actually went up exponentially, but it took about 3 years to report this particular finding. And by then, things have actually shifted on the ground. Practices change and evolve quickly. Policies move on very quickly as well. And by the time it came for us to report Core 2, and we produced, for example, 7 volumes of 250-page technical reports. It's huge. And by the time we produced this for the policymakers, there was a risk that a lot of it is not really that relevant, and it's largely because it's not timely. We revised the entire core design, and in core 3 onwards, we've decided to create infrastructures to really support the translation in a very rapid way. And one of the requirements for us is a time requirement. From the start of collecting data all the way to the presentation of the initial set of findings requires us to do that in 12 to 18 months. That is extremely fast for any research study to do so. 12 to 18 months from the start of data collection, we have to begin to prepare reporting in about 1.5 years' time. Now, that allows us to attend to that timeliness factor. And because we are building on established methodologies, the rigor is still there. And it allows us to do a lot of boundary crossing work because we are increasing, for example, the inclusion of MOE collaborators in our project. Our presentations are highly curated and designed, customized for the various divisions and departments and the various policymakers that we have to present our research to. So a lot of that is still happening. We are still in progress in terms of the boundary workers that we are creating all the time. And I want to end with this particular slide, which is this question about the kinds of partnership that's required in order for that translation and engagement and moving research knowledge towards policy for them to use. I think we begin with this key thing that it should focus on a problem or policy or practice that cannot be solved internally. In other words, the ministry or the government requires the university's help, and both of us have a focus on a shared problem or a goal. I think that's important. The second thing that's critically important, I think, is the need for an infrastructure in order to enable this kinds of translation to occur. The research brokering organization. The third point or factor is really the design principles. We are talking about an interesting situation, if you like, where the ministry is our funders and also our consumers of that knowledge as well. Trust, respect, relationship building, time, commitment, all that takes time for us to develop. And partnerships are ultimately a form of communication between different communities and a form of learning. We're always continuously learning. New priorities will come up, new people will come into play, new policymakers will come in. And the higher up as we go, the more important it is for us to be synchronized and aligned to some of the policy considerations and how we have to develop that kind of translation. With that, thank you very much. It's a lot to take in, but there'll be a Q&A later on where we can unpack some of this stuff. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Dennis. And yes, as Dennis has reminded us, there will be a chat later on, as well as time for you to ask your questions. So please do plonk in your questions into the Q&A function for Dennis if you have any that is on your mind. And as I speak, I already have a lot of questions from Dennis's presentation, so I will be engaging him in a bit. So thank you very much. Next up, we have Dr. Justin Lee, who will be speaking and sharing with us. Justin is the Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Policy Lab at the Institute of Policy Studies, National University of Singapore. He is working with partners to implement participatory budgeting at a town council and hopes to start a special version of a citizens' assembly designed to bridge division. He has created a wiki platform that allows citizen mapping of social needs and community assets. You can find out more through socialcollab.sg. And he will soon be testing whether a roving community innovation lab can actually catalyze local initiatives and incubate community-owned businesses in different neighborhoods. He serves on the research committees of Singapore, Singapore's Children's Society, and as well as CINDA. So Justin, I'll hand the time over to you.
Thanks, Lorraine. Thanks for having me. And as I was listening to Dennis playing this role as intermediary between different parties, I can feel it's being squeezed by all sides, right? Because the university wants you to do rigorous research. Policymakers want you to have impact and implication. So I feel your pain. And so today I will share a bit about our experiences. But to start, just kind of background to where I'm from. So Policy Lab is set up as a policy innovation unit. So we look at solutions. We do applied research, but more focused on solutions. And it's a departure from what IPS traditionally does as a think tank. So we think of ourselves as now moving into the think and do space, because now we're doing pilots and policy experiments, and often that includes operational implementation work. Now, what's policy innovation work? To simplify things, I have a functional typology of applied research. Either you do research to understand problems, or to develop or design solutions, or to evaluate those solutions. So if you look at the bottom part, if you're, let's say, a nonprofit or a social service agency, you actually do applied research. You understand maybe the people with disabilities and their needs. Then you develop, let's say, a vocational training program, and then you evaluate your program. If you move slightly higher up the value chain, let's say you're a large social service agency, maybe you focus on not just a specific need of your client group, but the need for employment in general for people with disabilities. And then there's a whole portfolio of services you have. You have vocational training, internships, and job matching. And then you do portfolio evaluation, did people with disabilities secure jobs? If you go up further, maybe on the Ministry of Social and Family Development, you actually have to map out the overall landscape of needs, right? And it's not just employment, it's early intervention, education, social inclusion, etc. And then it's not one solution or a portfolio, it's a whole master plan, which includes early intervention to special schools to employment support. And then after you do all that, you can say, well, the people with disabilities fully included in Singapore society. So if you look at the middle part, that's where we are. A lot of academics actually either do the left side or the right side. And there's fewer research centers that actually focus on solutions and innovation. So just quick background, these are some of the things we do and some of the work streams we have. I won't run through them because you can look at the slides if you want to. These are some experiments we did with one pocket of funding. Tote Board also supported us in trying some of these more citizen deliberation projects. We sometimes run conferences, we organize study trips, and actually Dennis came on one of these study trips with us to Scotland. But actually more of the kind of interesting stuff relevant to this webinar is more from Baltimore, where we learn about interesting educational equity initiatives. Sometimes we have fellowship programs, and this is just some of the stuff that we did. But on to today's topic is was asked to share a bit of our sensibilities in engaging policymakers and also other stakeholders. So because of where we are, I mean, we are able to lead with a solution, and sometimes leading with the solutions to your policymakers lands better because they know where you are trying to get to. If I had proposed to do a research project, sometimes that's almost harder. Let's say I wanted to propose a research project to study predatory lending and its effects on low-income families. And then sometimes, actually ministry, because our government has such a large administrative apparatus, quite often I think they actually know more about the problem than you do. And so it might be quite hard to persuade anyone that their research is worth doing and they can contribute in a way in which they don't understand, especially if you are going to them to propose a research project that you want their support or you want funding. So instead, for example, because of where we are, we can leave the solution. We said, wouldn't it be cool to have a community fund that has that disperses interest-free loans to the poor so they don't get into a cycle of debilitating debt. So that's that. And then the research supports that project. And more often than not, we find that when you lead with a solution, you're more likely to get positive responses or reactions. And actually having conversations with different stakeholders, I found that talking about problems is generally quite draining. If you talk about solutions, especially if your solutions is strong or interesting, or it excites people, the energy changes in a room. Leading with a solution is also useful in the sense that sometimes mindsets are hard to change. So if you're in a position whereby you can test a new idea concretely, you can win the argument through demonstration. You did a pilot and this is what happened, rather than convince people that this will work theoretically. Now, strong solutions can sometimes, in our experience, shed new light on the problem. When you see a strong and concrete solution, it helps to understand the problem in a way that that you may not have seen before. So I give you an example. When we went to Baltimore, we saw this African American group. They were paying slightly older African American youth to teach math to their slightly younger cohorts. And they were paying because otherwise they'd be flipping burgers in McDonald's. Then so now they teach. They, instead of working with their hands, they're knowledge workers, and they teach and they solidify their own foundations in math. They support their own community. They teach in a language with cultural references familiar to their community. But last of all, so that the employment and economics are in place, they also care about the social solidarity. They actually create a climate whereby the community feels that their fates are intertwined with one another, that they will support and care for each other. And so then that made me reflect on our own approach to when kids don't do well in school. Our own approach is private tuition. And what occurred to me is that our whole logic actually is not just a solution. Our whole logic is different because ours is have quick, easy wins before you scale. And so we pick tuition because it's an easy thing. You can stitch together. You can't afford tuition, there'll be volunteers, so you can subsidize the tuition. But for them, the whole approach was you do it all at once, or if not, maybe it's not even worth doing. And so that fundamentally helped us reassess our assumptions of what makes sense, at least to me. Now, what counts as a strong solution? It can be small, the idea can be small, the project can be small, can touch only a few people, but it has to have a seed of systemic change. So interest-free loans to the poor is not just some rotating savings and credit. It's actually a conversation about our extractive financial system, about money as a commons instead of as a commodity. Peer-to-peer learning, of course, which is the example I just gave, as opposed to the private sector solution or market solution is private tuition. This, if you can unlock the learning capacity of the community or the youth themselves to teach and learn from one another, then it creates this kind of unhealthy profiteering. We only have the private market solution or the non-profit ones that subsidizes the market, in fact. So a strong solution can be quite interesting. So if the conversations about solutions, sometimes it's better than just talking rigorous research only about the problems. Yeah, Dennis touched on this, the modes of communicating and writing. I think academic research writing, of course, incentivizes theoretical contributions, less on practical implications. And sometimes the recommendations are almost an afterthought. Like you finish your research and then you're expected to say something about so what, and you say something about that, sometimes almost without necessarily connecting it directly to your findings, and afterthought, and almost it feels like the academics don't really care about this. I've had conversation with them and say, oh, well, it's not actually my job. That's the policymaker's job. My job is to do the research, to understand it in depth. Let them figure it out. So then there's even a kind of barrier towards connecting the dots to some extent, which is why Dennis is saying that all these intermediaries and knowledge brokers are useful. We found that one way, and also that actionable insights are not that easy to achieve. There's plenty of findings, plenty of insights, but a concrete actionable insight is an art. No time to talk about that, but we can talk about it later if you want. The writing, for example, sometimes our SOP is to have 2-page concept papers because people don't read, right? You send them a research report, 20 pages, and then they'll probably decide if it immediately seems not relevant to them, they'll dismiss it. But you send people a 2-page concept paper indicating a solution they are keen to test, why it's interesting, how you might do it here, and with who. That's the start of a conversation. So we do a lot of 2-page concept papers, floating ideas around, because of course it's not just policymakers you chat with, it's implementing agencies, it's funders and community, etc. And that's quite useful to us. Once the concept paper buys you time to have a conversation and then people are kind of warm to it, you can work on that 20 to 50-page research proposal to secure the funding. So that's how we do it. We've also found that, of course, a lot of my colleagues in IPS write op-eds, and op-eds are useful if your target is the general reading public, but short policy briefs may actually be better. IPS has some policy briefs, but it's always structured as about 3 or 4 pages, and the recommendation is upfront. And then the rest of the policy brief is, so it's the other way around, right? What is the problem? No. And then the end recommendation. What are we saying? What is the recommendation? Short, succinct, and the rest of that very brief paper provides the analysis and justification for the recommendation. Solutions, however, are especially hard if they kind of go beyond the operating paradigm of how we think about solutions. So if you want to, do peer-to-peer learning, it's going to be much harder than if you say you want to do a version of tuition. And it may sound foreign or even be perceived to be threatening to certain stakeholders who have invested a lot of their own time and emotion or energy or reputation on the existing solution. So I guess when we do things that are new, we try to bring everyone along, even those who don't see eye to eye on things. And we found that brokering across divergent, competing, or even as antagonistic groups and ideologies are useful, because then you get a sense of what everyone's vantage point is. And if you are an artful intermediary, you find an ability to find some common ground that you can move ahead on. And this actually, I learned more recently, because you're always pushing new things and ideas. You do the research and you think that, yeah, this is very interesting and very cool, that people should come along with you. And then sometimes you forget that there is the status quo. And so then the status quo, so this respect the status quo thing actually came from pretty radical cooperative, right? And so then they were saying, respect the status quo. This wasn't coming from the government or civil servants. And that made me realize, yeah, actually, the status quo, whatever is the dominant paradigm, is dominant for good reason. It works really well for a lot of circumstances and conditions. And if you don't appreciate its value, then it's much harder to suggest an innovation or a change or a shift to it. We can talk about other stuff, but I'll just want to end up with this. This is advanced level skill. This is, I see this kind of work almost sometimes a lot of people do this work as karate because they are fighting against, you have opponents everywhere, right? People who disagree with your ideas, and you're trying to win the argument through the forcefulness or the strength of your abilities and your arguments and the research. But I think Aikido offers a different sensibility, which I find quite useful as a guiding sensibility. Aikido suggests that you have to kind of go with like Dennis was saying, what be kind of in sync with the policy direction. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be co-opted or agree with where it's going, because your job is to figure out what's useful to go in. But if you can mobilize the strengths of your opponents to go to where you want it to go, that's beautiful. And something I learned about Aikido, in addition to its high-level skill, is you have to reduce harm to your opponent. So it's always it's not winning the argument and then saying, haha, you see, I was right. It's almost sometimes allowing your opponents who disagreed with you in the first place to play the hero's role. Sometimes you don't even have to take credit. You step in the background, because if the goal is the new direction or the new solution or something that's interesting, you're hoping to nurture, then this approach I find it's quite interesting to consider very seriously. But it's high-level skill because it means don't take credit for your work sometimes. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. There were a lot of gems in what you were saying, and I was kind of like, torn between letting you continue and asking you to wrap up before we can continue with the next portion on the fireside chat. So ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and attendees who are joining us right now online, this is we are now going into a segment of what we will call a fireside chat. For those who don't know, Singapore has no fireside. But yes, the idea is that we kind of emulate having a discussion between myself and our guests about today's topic. So if you have not you have burning questions and you have not posted them into the Q&A, please do so. I do see a question in the chat itself. I will try and get to that. But maybe as a start, if I can kind of understand from both Justin and Dennis, if you could share with us a little bit about how do you think the positioning of IPS and of your different institutes basically, how does that help to shape the engagement that you have with the policymakers at your institution? So maybe I thought we could start with Justin.
Our institute has been described as being close to government, but not part of government. So having that relationship is quite a different one from regular research centers. You have to see who's running the ship, right? Our director is somebody trusted by the government. If he invites somebody, they might come. We can have conversations with senior policymakers. So that's useful, but also actually a lot of the research fellows have over time through their work developed close and trusting relationships with different ministries. And so that helps, I think, the overall portfolio. And then over time, the institute has acquired a kind of reputation that, if you want work done by people who understand how we think, you might go to IPS.
That's
There's
nice.
almost a brand name there, which is convenient.
Yeah, and with that brand name, I suppose the word trust also comes in. So it kind of builds on each other as well. Having the trust, building the reputation, and then back to trust again. Dennis, would you like to add on in terms of NIE? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's slightly different from IPS in the sense that while IPS, I'm guessing, engages with a lot more ministries than we do. We've dealt largely with MOE, the Ministry of Education, and as a result of that, the relationship that we've garnered with MOE has taken quite a bit of time. And because it has taken a bit of time, it's allowed us to create those kinds of infrastructures that we need in order for us to do that kind of engagement. So to give an example, we now have what's known as a Research Translation Steering Committee, which is jointly managed by NIE and MOE, where we would look into the various research studies that's been funded and completed, what their findings are, and how they can be translated at a systems level to the entire system. So that took a bit of time in order for it to be created, but it is now a committee that allows a lot of the research work that we do to kind of potentially spread through the system once they've considered that particular research or intervention or innovation is something that can be translated through the entire system, and how. So that's the job of that particular committee. But I like Justin's approach, which is leading with a solution, and that creates a very interesting new space for us to really think about it. For a while, we've been trying to figure out, because policymakers, especially the so I think it's important, and this is in response to another question that I see as well. It is important to kind of distinguish between the different levels of policymakers, if you like. So you have the political leadership, the politicians, those people who are elected into those positions, and then you have the professional staff, the civil servants, the directors, divisional directors, the permanent secretaries, etc., and all that. And each one of them would have different ways that we need to respond to them, I guess, in many ways. So the way in which we engage with those different levels would also be different as well. And I think the idea of leading with solutions and seeding ideas and all that is something that we should really try and do, I think. For a long time, we've been asking ourselves, can we do policy research? And what does it mean to do policy research? And I think IPS has taken quite a big lead in that way of thinking about the relationship between policy and research, which is fantastic.
Yeah, that is actually quite an interesting idea that also struck me. And So kind of like in line with what you were saying just now, Dennis, and as well as Justin. I mean, it's I won't say it's easy, but it when we talk about, oh, let's go to the policymakers with to lead with solutions. But in the process, there must be what this colleague was written in the question, different tiers of people. I would call them maybe policy influencers or people working in different divisions or branches that have an impact to what goes into a paper that eventually makes its way up to the office that makes the decision, or the political holders, etc. So I'm just wondering, how do you go about engaging these different tiers of policymakers, and are there any similarities or differences, or differences? Yeah.
I guess I can go. I think Dennis has said that different tiers, right? So there's the political leadership, then you have seniors and civil servants, directors, and then to your rank and file. And we make friends across. So it's actually very hard to have enough social capital to be able to connect to the political office holders. Some parts of IPS has that capital also. So sometimes that's good because just somebody makes a decision and then that thing can move. So that's the power of connecting right up to the top or higher levels. It's important, I think, to connect also to your peers in government, because then it's just kind of to understand a bit of their operating considerations when they're doing certain things, like what do they care about? And when you understand what they care about, like the question was saying, policymakers know so much more. How do you identify a solution you consider worth exploring? If you have friends in the civil service, they will tell you, yeah, we did this before, or we did that before, but, and then they tell you. So because our government is so big, and many agencies have a research function. They've probably looked at the stuff that you might be interested in, but the thing is, they've already developed a position about it, which you don't know. So if you can understand that, maybe you can it can give you inputs on how you might tweak your solution in a way that addresses their concerns or considerations or their positions. Like we were trying to do participatory budgeting. So initially just float to MP. Then the kind of consideration was, oh yeah, residents voting on each other's ideas. What if they fight with each other? Okay, so I think that's a important consideration from their point of view. So we have to create in our process something that assuages the anxieties, something that will be clear, manage expectations, all that. So that's really useful to know. So make friends at all levels, I think.
Indeed. Dennis, any thought?
Yeah, so this is in response to the different levels kind of question, right? As researchers who have to communicate with policymakers, there's two words that we always dread, and those two words are "so what," and and we dread that because we do the research, we come up with findings, we present ideas, and the research is primarily driven by some problem or practice or policies, etc., and all that. But because the research and the problem tends to be working in a space that the policymakers or the professional staff are already familiar, they're already engaging, or they're familiar with that area. So sometimes what we generate, or the way we present it, is not insightful enough or not impactful enough, that it's not that it's not something new to them. So that's why the "so what" question often comes up. And that's how we always have to craft our responses and craft our work so that we can move beyond the "so what," or even like what Justin say, present it in a slightly different way, that allows for that space for us to have that conversation, so that we don't face that "so what" kind of question. So what suggests that there's nothing new that you've done, right? Everything we know already. But I think that's the important part about research. There's always something that's potentially new that they don't know about. Now, in terms of the responses in the different levels, right? For myself, I think it depends on, which direction are we moving? Are we moving from for example, from the curriculum, in MOE's cases, the curriculum branches up to, the divisions, and it goes up to the permanent secretary and goes up to the minister, that kind of thing? Or does it come down? And the direction matters a lot. When we have to present to the minister, for example, we have to present up the ladder, if you like, first. So by the time it gets up to the minister, the people who sits in that particular room would have heard a lot of our ideas and can provide their inputs and insights to the minister to say, this is what we've done, this is what we're interested in, etc., and all that. So that's moving upwards, and that presentation gets refined as it goes up the ladder, if you like. But sometimes there's something that comes down from the minister, and then we have to react to it. And again, that is a different way of engagement as well. That tends to be a lot more reactionary because the minister has a particular concern. The one of the biggest concerns right now, for example, and one that we don't have a lot of research about, is on vaping, for example, that's happening among youths, right? It's a new social problem that has emerged, and it is one that we don't have research specifically on vaping among youths, especially among students. And so we are caught in a way, off guard. How do we respond to that? Oh, let's do a research and we'll give you a result in 2 to 3 years' time. I don't think that's going to be that useful. On the other hand, there's a lot of research out there that can respond to it, be it international research or be it some local research around addiction, etc., and all that. And we can mobilize that very quickly, curate that, synthesize that, and present, this is what we know, right? And hopefully that's something that perhaps, those people around the table, around the minister, may not have seen that kind of research yet. So it's for us, it's up or down, it matters a lot.
Thanks so much, Dennis. And I mean, Dennis and Justin has kind of tried to answer that the question about identifying a solution that policymakers could explore. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that, since policymakers know so much.
Sorry, are you asking Dennis or me?
I'm asking Dennis, sorry. I mean, if
Me?
you kind of answer it just now, like making friends, talking to people in a ministry, but I'm just wondering whether Dennis have anything to add for that.
How do you identify a solution that they should consider worth exploring, is it?
You need to have a civil servant whisperer asking what they are thinking. I have one, or now I have a few.
I just want to respond to what Justin has said as well. In how do you identify a solution? Through many conversations. I think having a dialogue with the people who are important at play and understanding what they know, I think, and what are the parameters or that paradigm that they work with, and where we can probe, where we can move, I think is important for us. I think that kind of conversation, that's why I think trust, relationship, commitment, all those are very important factors. Having a whisperer helps too.
Yeah. Thanks, Dennis. So that kind of lends itself very nicely to Evelyn's question. So you mentioned about having multiple and different kinds of conversation, right? So Evelyn has a question: to what extent are practitioners or teachers involved in these NIE MOE conversations on translating research to practice? And are MOE officials up to date with real school concerns to allow the benefits from NIE's research insights to eventually translate to the classrooms? Maybe the second one, we might need a MOE official, but I don't know whether you have any thoughts on this, Dennis.
So it's for me, that
Yes.
since it's MOE.
It's a question for Dennis.
To what extent are practitioners involved in the NIE MOE conversations on translating research to practice? Now, there's the example that I'm using is based on the core research program, which is designed specifically and targeting policymakers because it's a large-scale study. One of the hopes and aspirations that we have in terms of core research is to see how we can actually translate a lot of our findings towards practice. to engage practitioners and schools, especially the schools that we work closely with in collecting data, in understanding classroom practices, etc., and all that. Now, there are a lot of other research going on in NIE as well, and those research, there is a mixture, if you like, some which are, again, other large-scale studies, some which really have that kind of relevance towards policy. But there are also interventions and innovations that's being funded, which works closely with schools. And those are the ones which really helps to translate in a very rapid cycle. We call them design-based research, where they are continuously working with schools to refine practice based on the research that they are collecting and interpreting and translating or bringing it back to the teachers, if you like. So there's a lot of that that's happening around the school environment or the school system that we have here as well. I think nowadays the bigger problem is, getting access to schools, because the schools are so busy with research work, be it from NIE or from their own staff, that they are continuously translating that into their own practice as well. So I think the extent in which teachers are involved in our conversations. There's another thing as well. Teachers come through the NIE system, right? They attend programs, and a lot of our programs are increasingly tapped onto the local research as well. So almost one of the requirements for many of our programs is that they have to talk about the local research for that particular topic or that particular content that they're teaching. So that's something that it has an immediate translation from our research into something that our student teachers or our attendees, participants can use as well.
Yeah. It sounds like from Evelyn's question is kind of a complaint. Like, yeah, you say, NIE can have conversation MOE, but nobody ever asked me. I'm a teacher, right? Nobody ever consulted me. And actually that indicates that there's a real possibility, as if Dennis, you want to play the knowledge broker, that you institutionalize participatory research with the schools. So you have not by chance, some teachers come, but yes, we will have this. And then the teachers who want to step up will then come and inform on the research agenda and give inputs. And actually there's value for you to MOE, because now I know what the schools are thinking. You're too busy to talk to them, right? But we know.
Yeah. I think part of the challenge sometimes is that so we conduct teacher interviews with all our participants, all our teachers, and the last question that we always ask them is, if there's one thing that you can feedback to MOE, what would it be? And we collate all that and we present that to MOE as a series of responses from our teachers and all that. And some of the, I'm guessing that a lot of that kind of feedback MOE already knows, right? Reduce the pressure on examination, for example, give more time for innovation to happen in our classrooms, etc., and all that. And they are aware of that. And the question is, how do they then attend to those kinds of feedback and improve the system in a way that, without sacrificing some of the important things that we need to have in our education system. So yeah, I like the idea of being more participatory and more democratic, if you like, with our teachers, and that's something that we are definitely experimenting with in terms of our core research program. Hopefully we can do that.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether you can share a little bit of your challenges with our audience, like in terms of engaging policymakers. Maybe you can, I don't want to open a can of worms, so I'll just maybe you can share with us one particular challenge that you have in engaging policymakers, and how do you go about mitigating that?
So because our work is supposed to be policy innovation, and some funders will say, I want you to try new things, new interesting ideas, push the boundaries, take some risks. And then on the other hand, they say, but we want the policyholders to be okay with it, to seek their blessings, to give approval sometimes. So it's not impossible. It's a difficult task. It's super challenging to do both things at the same time. But if you manage to do it, actually, it's really good, because then the policymakers will take very long, because you're asking them to take a risk to try something they haven't tried before. You can't even point to where in Singapore it's been done. But once they come along, actually, almost a mainstreaming path has been built for you. They are already saying, okay, we want to do this, but everything doing government surely must look nice and have scale one, right? So they're already thinking of scaling even before the thing has started. So that's the good thing about it. It's also really hard. So my runway for getting a project off the ground, super long.
Oh, I see. Okay. Dennis?
Well, the immediate challenge that I'm facing right now is, of course, preparing for a presentation to policymakers. It is a extremely difficult task for me because I'm far more familiar with academic writing, academic presentations. You ask me to go for a conference, I can present a conference deck, very fast. But if you ask me to prepare a deck of slides for policymakers, it's such a mindset shift for me that I sometimes still cannot get it right. But the important outcome of that presentation is the thing that's really important for me. What would be the nudge? What would be the key driver that you're trying to convey to the policymakers? What are you trying to get them to change? And ultimately, I think that's the important message that I'm trying to convey across. That if we can actually get them to think or point or like what Justin said, point or think in the right direction, right? I think that's I'm going to pat myself in the back for just opening up that that kind of inception, the movie, you're seeding that little idea there and getting things moving along. I think that's for me the biggest challenge and the biggest reward.
Thanks so much, Dennis and Justin. I know we are at 4:01, 1 minute past, but I thought I'd just ask for a closing question. I think for a lot of the attendees today, they might be researchers who are starting out, wondering really how to engage policymakers at their level effectively. So whichever level that they could start with. So I'm just wondering if you have any advice for researchers, how can they get started to bridge that divide between research and policy making? Maybe I'll go with Dennis first.
The most practical suggestion I can give for this is if you are a researcher and you are pursuing a research proposal, invite people who are in the policy sphere, be it curriculum specialists, be it other collaborators, into your project. Get them involved in your project and understand what their needs are. I think for me, that the value of having those kinds of collaborators in your project is extremely important. And that will help begin, you understanding their needs, understanding their language, understanding their world. For me, that's as a researcher, that's important.
Yeah. Thanks. Justin?
I suppose if you're part of a center, an institute, and if your leadership doesn't have that social capital to connect to the, political office holders and all that, and your governing board doesn't have that, never mind, you can form a free advisory committee. You can give them a terms of reference and appoint the right people there. And people will show up because they're honored to be asked. And often that's really good enough, then they understand what they're doing. They are the ones that help you connect. They open the doors, you go and meet people. So that's from a center point of view. I know even some social service agencies do that really well because they're really small. They can't afford. Then they just appoint research committee. Then these people show up and do work for free. Very clever. But if you're an individual researcher, I guess maybe actually it's really useful to just make friends. I mean, have lunch, have tea, have coffee with people, and then always show up face to face. Because if you learn how to read people, and if people feel safe enough to level with you, you get a lot of interesting insights about the operational considerations. And then that really helps as you're scoping a project. Then over time, you develop trusting relationships. From that, you to scope projects to try to get people to come along to you. You're actually co-creating projects with them in the long run.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Love these thoughts. Really engage colleagues right from the start, people that you think would be potential stakeholders, and have an influence to the different changes that you want to make in society. So thank you very much, Justin and Dennis, for indulging us with your presence and also for sharing the work that you do, both at NIE and also at IPS. To everyone who's attending this webinar online, from wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. See you soon. Thank you.